Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, hate speech versus free speech in Australia. We'll examine why the government wants to repeal laws that currently ban racist language. Wrapping up the week, filling in for Malika Bilal, we have digital producer Omar Bidar. So in Australia, this is a hot topic. But for our international audience, are they getting it too?
It's actually equally hot internationally because almost everyone has something to say about free speech and where the limits are exactly. We actually have quite a few comments here. Take a look at my computer. Tari Dumbo is one of the people who pitched the story to us. He says Tony Abbott, that's the Prime Minister of Australia, says he's trampling on the rights of Indigenous Australians by making it lawful to offend, insult, or humiliate someone on the basis of their race. On the other hand, we also have Will Dallas Brooks here who says freedom of speech must remain free. Being offended is not enough grounds to sue. He goes on to say that minorities is a silly term. We are all Australian. So that's just a sense of the contentious debate that we're seeing online. Right. Of course, for those of you at home, you can be part of this debate by using the hashtag you see on your screen right now, AJStream. So send us your tweet.
And today's show was suggested by two Stream community members, Michelle Rosenberg and Tari Dambo on Facebook. Omar just read out Tari's Facebook comment just there. Thank you so much. Do you have a story you want to share? Tell us at facebook.com/AJstream, and your idea could wind up on the stream. It's very easy. You just scroll down here, you'll find a little gap and pitch us an idea.
My name is Hakan Kamuz. I'm the chairman of Mischiat UK, and I am in the stream.
So right now in Australia, it's illegal to offend, insult or humiliate somebody based on their race or ethnicity. But citing free speech, the government wants to change that by getting rid of part of their Racial Discrimination Act. Those who support the repeal argue that hate speech laws stifle public discussion. But would scrapping the law hurt society and maybe open the door for more racist behaviour, as opponents say? Here's how some Australian politicians have responded.
It will encourage bullies, it will create division and intolerance, it will damage the fabric of our society, and most importantly, it will hurt people, real people, individuals who will experience real pain.
Sometimes, Madam Speaker, free speech will be speech which upsets people, which offends people. Sometimes people won't like it.
Well, Mr. President, people do have a right to be bigots, you know. In a free country, people do have rights to say things that other people find offensive or insulting or bigoted.
Well, that's a political debate and it's already started, and we're going to pick it right up today. So should hate speech laws be repealed in the name of free speech rights? To help us talk about this, Chris Berg is Policy Director with the Institute for Public Affairs. He's joining us via Skype in Melbourne. In Canberra, we have Simon Rice. He's a civil rights advocate and law professor at the Australian National University College of Law. And in Sydney, we have Kirsty Parker. She's the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. So it's great to have you all here in the stream. Let's start with something that you're going to hear an awful lot of, 18C. 18C, that's part of the Racial Discrimination Act. Have a look here on my laptop. And this is part of our conversation today. It is unlawful for a person to do an act if the act is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate, or maybe intimidate another person or a group of people. And the act is done because of race, colour, or national or ethnic origin. Chris, what is the issue with that? Why would that particular clause in the Racial Discrimination Act, why should that even be considered to be taken out?
Well, it's quite clearly a restriction on freedom of expression, and I don't think anybody in this debate suggests otherwise. It was designed to be a restriction on what Australians can and cannot say. The problem that we've seen over the last couple of years is that Section 18C has been activated, in so many words, by a major and highly controversial case targeting a Conservative columnist in Melbourne named Andrew Bolt for a series of columns that he wrote, and they were found to be offensive, insulting, humiliating and intimidating to people on the basis of their ethnic origin. And that case really kick-started a major debate about the role of 18C, and in my view, it helps build the case for expanding what Australians' rights to freedom of speech are, not just here, but across the board in a whole lot of different areas as well. So in my view, Section 18C should be absolutely repealed, and I support the current government's proposals to go 95% of the way there.
Kirsty?
Femi, do you have, you've shown people a copy of 18C.
Yeah.
Do you have a copy of 18D?
I do, but I'm not going to torment everybody who's watching the stream right now with the whole RDA Act for Australia. But make your point, because I know you're going somewhere with this.
Well, yes, because it's remarkable how quickly and easily everyone is now talking about 18C. As Chris said, but for the Andrew Bolt case, we'd be continuing with the last 20 years of unremarkable operation of the Act. And one of the reasons why it's been unremarkable is that, as well as 18C, there's 18D, which creates exceptions, which acknowledges that there's a great deal that can be said on the basis of race, which will offend, insult, or humiliate. But it's permitted because it's part of public debate. So there's very extensive exceptions for artistic performance, for fair comment, for matters of public interest, which have created a very, very large space for race speech in the last 20 years.
All right. So, Kirsty,
the problem is that Andrew Bolt failed to take advantage of that exception, and as a result is aggrieved.
All right. So Kirsty, just bring us back down to earth here and talk realities of your life, of First People's lives, or people who may well be affected if 18C gets scrapped. Tell us some real life stories.
Yeah, sure. And there are many, many examples. I know very few Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who haven't borne the brunt of racist speech, not necessarily racist violence, although we know there's a very clear nexus between the two. We believe that, and you know, we've had some reference to the actual Act about what people can and can't do and what the exemptions are, and it's really important to us that people understand that there is no attempt here to prevent people from talking about matters of public importance, but it's the manner in which they do so, and that was really the crux of the case that both Chris and Simon have spoken about. Not that there was a discussion had about something, but the manner in which it was said. And, you know, for me it's quite, and he's talking about, Chris raised the Bolt case. We're talking about a case here where a judge found that comments were made that were wrong, that they were inflammatory, that they were provocative, that they went
Kirsty,
way past the mark.
Take a breath for a moment. Let me just help our audience out here, because all the Aussies absolutely know what we're talking about. I'm just going to do this very briefly, but I want us to broaden out from here. So Andrew Bolt is a columnist. He works for the Herald Sun News. He writes for them. He wrote an article a couple of years ago, White Fellas in the Black. What did that article say, Kirsty? Why did it cause so much trouble?
It really talked about a group of, or identified fair-skinned Aboriginal people, so people who don't have particularly dark skin. It intimated that some high-profile, lighter-skinned Aboriginal people had chosen to assert their Aboriginal heritage on the basis that it would benefit them, for example, in workplaces, created prestige for them, took up positions.
Basically, you were saying they were pretending to be kind of black and they're really white. So they're using their white privilege, but trying to sneak in and get more benefits. I'm just going to wrap it up slightly, summarise it for our international audience. I'm going to move on from the Bolt story. That's the story that kind of started this conversation. But our community are broadening out a little bit.
They're addressing specifically the extent to which these things are subjective. I mean, how do you judge what actually is offensive speech? So we have a couple of people here commenting. TV Miller says, speech is ethereal, actions are tangible. How can law govern that which cannot be held as evidence of action? And we have Sagar here who says, terms like offend and humiliate are way too subjective. They will be abused more than used. So Chris, is that one of the concerns, is that we won't agree on what specifically might be offensive and what's not, and therefore these are difficult things to regulate?
Well, in a funny way, it doesn't matter whether we agree or not, because what it does is hand those questions off to the judiciary. So one of the very controversial parts of the reforms and one of the controversial parts of the acts is how it hands off to judges to make these decisions for us. So it's all very well and good to debate whether the word offend or so forth are subjective, but judges decide whether they are. And these are judges who have to imagine how a community may feel, or the greater Australian population may feel. When it comes down to it, when we talk about limitations on freedom of speech, we're not talking about protecting individual people against offence. We're talking about giving judges the power to decide what is beyond the pale, because the words offend, insult, humiliate and intimidate, they have to be interpreted.
Okay.
There's no way getting around that.
Simon.
But yes, that doesn't properly explain the way our discrimination laws work. One of the really special things about discrimination law in Australia is that you actually have to make a complaint that gets subject to investigation and conciliation. It is not possible to take a complaint straight to court. Judges decide less than 5% of cases made under the Racial Discrimination Act. The rest of them, in other words, almost all of them, are resolved by sitting down around a table and talking things through and reaching a private conciliated settlement. The judges are at the tip of the iceberg, and a discussion that focuses on them completely distorts the work that the Racial Discrimination Act does in the community. It creates a forum for people to raise a grievance, to sit down and talk it through. It's a really remarkable and precious part of the Act. We're conciliating this, we're giving a signal to the community.
I'd agree with that, Femi. There is no suggestion here that there's been an avalanche of cases in the courts. As Simon said, something like, I think 3% of the matters that come before the Human Rights Commission ever make it inside a court. It's really important also that people understand this is not just about mere hurt feelings where people are slightly offended. These are the only matters that ever make it to a court are those where there have been serious and profound impacts of what was said or discussed in these areas. So it's important.
I think that's a remarkably strange objection, though, because what we do see is cases come before a court, and the mere fact that that is a percentage of a broader list of cases doesn't make them any less concerning, and it doesn't make the Act any less of a restriction on freedom of speech. When it comes down to it, there are cases that come before a court. Some of them are significant cases, some of them are less significant cases, and all of them are deeply concerning, regardless of how many have been conciliated by the Australian Human Rights Commission. If conciliation was the only thing that the Act did,
so
I would
Chris,
have
tell
much
us a
less of a problem,
case
but that's not what happens.
Tell us a case that concerned you that went through with this sort of 18C part of the Racial Discrimination Act. Tell us one case where you were, I'm not happy about that.
Other than Bolt.
Yes, other than that.
Well, other than Bolt, of course.
Yes.
Of course. So there's a wide range of cases that happened back in the early 2000s. There was a famous case of a Holocaust denier who went to court and was found to have breached the Act. We get lots of different small cases.
Let us just understand you, Chris, just let us understand you. So you think that a Holocaust denier shouldn't have been prosecuted? Is that what you're saying? He should be able to say the Holocaust didn't exist?
Well, Holocaust denial is legal in Australia, and it's legal in almost every country in the world. And the problem was for this particular Holocaust denier that he was being deeply anti-Semitic as part of his Holocaust denial. But there are also some smaller... So this was a very famous case. There are also some much smaller ones. So, for instance, a lawyer called a security guard a Singaporean prick at one stage and then went off to court and got fined. There was a website comment that got a newspaper in trouble, and they were fined $12,000. Okay. There are family feuds that get taken to court under this sort of thing. One brother-in-law sued his other brother-in-law for using a racial epithet in a family dispute. There's all sorts of things that go into this.
You've got a whole raft of them. You're seeing them as problematic. Simon, how do you view those cases, those stories?
Well, yes, I want to ask Chris, what is the problem with giving people a forum to say that their lives have been hurt by race-based speech, when the forum is one that is used by almost 100% of people confidentially to reach agreed settlements? You could recite all the facts that the Human Rights Commission reports. What's the problem with the government with our government saying to us, we will give you the opportunity to sit down and talk through with people the harm that they cause through their racist speech. It's a civilising forum, which the examples you've given have been opportunities for people to think twice about the deep hurt that they can cause.
Let me bring in the community. Gentlemen, take a breath for a moment, because I'm also going to bring in the community and see what they have to say.
We have some concerns about the actual tangible impact of repealing the law essentially could possibly have. So we have Abdi Kader here on Facebook who says, we believe the changes will lead to an increase in racially motivated cyberbullying, which in turn will lead to increased suicide, self-harm, and substance abuse. That changes run against the government's online child safety agenda. So Christy, my question to you is, do you see the potential for this kind of direct harm because of repealing this?
I certainly do. And this was something that came up earlier. This is not just about physical harm, it's about emotional harm, it's about psychological harm, which have very real impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for example. We know that the difference that racism makes to our lives is that it makes people fearful of participating in particular situations. It keeps people out of the workforce. It makes people physically sick. We know that racism contributes to poor mental health. Mental health contributes something like 15% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health burden, makes a very big difference to Aboriginal people's lives. Suicidal thoughts is also linked to mental illness, and we know that our young people, our young men and women suicide at 4 and 5 times the rate. Racism is a major contributor to the way that our people feel about themselves and the ability that we have to participate in society. And I can't accept that Australia wants to be a country where that's not something that people care about.
See, one of the arguments I've heard, Kirsty, is that now Australia is so evolved as a society, a community, that they've really sort of gone beyond having to have, in law, anti-racist legislation, that Australia is beyond that. But what's your experience and the experience of the First Peoples that you represent?
Absolutely. I disagree that we are evolved. I agree that we are evolving and that there are improvements being made. One of my other hats is as a member of the Board of Reconciliation Australia, which is this body that's essentially set up to try and improve the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, and we know that we are making some progress, some headway. We are deeply suspicious of each other, but we have a willingness to try to get to know each other so that we can create this more harmonious society.
Sure.
But we see weekly, matters being brought on social media, Facebook, etc., where we see people being abused on the basis of their race. To try and say that we are so evolved that these sorts of things don't happen is to deny the very real experiences of particularly my people on a daily basis, if not a weekly basis. It's a regular occurrence, it's a very frequent occurrence.
Omar.
So we have somebody else raising a different kind of question. We have David here tweeting in saying, the rights of people not to be vilified because of their race is more important than the rights of people to vilify those people. We need to draw a line in the sand. And Chris, I'm just curious, actually, do you recognize that as a right, the right not to be vilified on the basis of race? Do you think that's something that we're entitled to?
I think that it's something that we're absolutely entitled to, but I think the most important thing is that the law protects rights like freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is a particularly important and critical right because it goes to the very heart of our democracy. It is a fundamental liberty that we have to speak our mind. And so while I absolutely recognize that we have a right to live a life free of the vilification of others, I think that the law should be protecting freedom of speech much higher than basically any other right. Freedom of speech, when it comes down to it, is the right that activates democracy. We vote in our governments based on our open deliberation, and the government has no role in deciding what is legitimate and illegitimate deliberation.
I would say that Australia...
Simon, you go ahead,
Sorry,
Kirsty, and then I'll bring you back in. Go ahead, Simon.
I was going to say, I agree with Chris that free speech is essential to our democratic process. That's the free speech we're talking about. The idea of free speech, which is considerably broader that I can say anything I want about anyone I want whenever I want is completely unconnected with the democratic process. There is, I would say, and I'd ask Chris to comment, there is nothing that you can't say in Australia within the bounds of free speech that connects to democratic process. Public policy debate, comments on matters of our governance, politics are permitted. That's the exception that exists. Free speech defined in a way that you can say what you like when you like is beyond the bounds of the free speech that Chris has just defined.
Kirsty.
We're talking.
Well, I think it does, illustrate this furphy that speech is entirely free. There are limits placed on what people can say. You can't say things that go against, national security, for example. You can't say things in trade that are not correct. You can't send, offensive material through the post. There are limits, and this idea that free speech is unlimited, but also trumps any other a right, and in this case I'm talking about the right to feel safe, the right to be free from racial abuse, I think is unhelpful and just ignores the experiences of many people.
I'm just interested because I'm hearing from Chris and Simon and Kirsty, but I'm not getting a sense of what Australia is thinking. Chris, are you getting a lot of support from your point of view?
I think there's broad support on both sides of this story, to be honest. I think that a lot of people see freedom of speech as a really fundamental Australian value, but I also I think the polls also suggest that that people are also concerned about this sort of thing. The problem is with a lot of these polls and a lot of the debate is that the people interpret these questions as quite subjective about, and they're not totally sure how they operate in the judicial context as well. So this is a very, very live debate in Australia, and to be honest, it could go either way.
Right, and are First People supporting the idea that we should get rid of 18C?
You'd have to ask First People, please, Christy.
All right, Kirsty.
Kirsty, I want to make it very clear that I am a supporter of free speech. I don't know many Australians who don't want free speech, but they recognise that there are some other things that you need to take into consideration as well. You do need to balance these freedoms, and we would say that the current Act, as it stands, does balance those freedoms, and it sets up a process where we can decide whether people have acted unreasonably or not, and in very few of the cases that they might see the inside of a court. So we are arguing that there should be no change to the Act. There's been no compelling case made for change, and certainly not on the basis of one Conservative commentator who has been found to have acted unlawfully, not because he went there or raised something, but the manner in which he raised it. You know, when you're talking about provocative and inflammatory language, the judge actually said that he believed that there would be young and vulnerable Aboriginal Australians who would feel reluctant to identify based on the ferocity of the attacks in these articles. It's important that people get that.
All right, so that's Kirsty Parker. Kirsty Parker is the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. Also hearing from Simon Rice, who's a civil rights advocate and professor at the Australian National University College of Law, and Chris Berger is policy director with the Institute of Public Affairs. You see them there. We are not done yet. Just put a pause button on you for a moment. We are going to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. And the community, what are they saying?
The debate is very lively, actually, and ongoing. We have IG here who says, I consider any speech offensive if the person it is directed to does not like it. It's not a matter of free speech. On the other hand, Charlie says, whatever you want to say shouldn't be censored in any way. If you do, it's just the tyranny of the majority. So that's just a sense of what's happening online right now.
And if people are still thinking, I haven't got my question to Omar yet,
there's still plenty of time. They can still tweet it using the hashtag AJStream, and we'll get to it in the post show.
All right, so on the next program, Mexican activists say that a proposed telecom bill will give the government too much control over the media. So have a look back here on my laptop. This is the Twitter hashtag you have to look out for, hashtag EPN versus the internet, and then you can join in the conversation on Monday. Stay with us, the post show is next to stream.aljazeera.com. I will see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Streams online post show. We're talking about hate speech and free speech in Australia. Let's get right back to the conversation. If my memory serves me correctly, Simon was about to make a fantastic point. Simon, back to you.
Well, you can judge if it's fantastic. I was simply going to ask, in the debate we've been having over the last 3 weeks or so, I haven't heard anybody volunteer that there's something within Chris's definition of free speech, something that's relevant to social discussions, social issues, matters of policy, matters that concern Australian life. I haven't heard anybody say that there's something they feel they can't say under our current law. Nobody has yet said, I am constrained by our current law. There is something there's something race-based that I feel I want to say that the current law stops me from saying.
Well, I mean, the Bolt case demonstrates.
All right, I'm going to ban the Bolt case because we've actually gone over that quite a lot. And I don't feel we need to mention his name anymore.
What you want to say.
No, but other than that, I mean, and that was some time ago. Can you take us forward from there? Because otherwise we're just going to get stuck on one columnist, which seems to me like this conversation is bigger than that, or maybe it isn't. Chris?
No, this conversation is absolutely bigger than that.
All right,
but,
good.
What you hear from a number of newspapers and a number of editors is that they feel that the constraints provided by Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act raised the legal bar. Now, we have a huge number, as Kirsty has pointed out Kirsty has pointed out very, very well. We have a huge number of existing constraints on freedom of speech in Australia. For instance, we've got some extremely damaging defamation laws, sedition laws, those sorts of things. And what they feel is that the Racial Discrimination Act, as it's currently being interpreted, has created a new extra risk, in part because of these recent case law decisions.
But Chris, the problem is none of them have said. They may be saying that to you, and it's interesting for me to hear that. It's not been part of the public debate. No newspaper editors have come out and said that the landscape since this law began in 1995 has changed. There's been no contribution to the public debate from the people you referred to say, we think we're constrained. Nobody has said that the landscape has changed.
Simon, I can name chapter and verse on this one. Certainly the Herald Sun has, of course, which is the newspaper in part, but also the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald both editorialised against these laws because they believed that the offend and insult bar was much too low. And these are not news limited papers, these are Fairfax papers, and they have editorialised because they feel that it unduly constrains freedom of speech.
All right, gentlemen, let me just bring back the community. Go ahead, Kirsty, now I'll jump back to
Femi, I was just going to point out that there was no appeal in the case that we shall not mention.
That I am banning because this is a program about free speech, that I am overriding free speech about the Bolt case. All right, only because we haven't...
no appeal, but can I also just take up another matter?
Please do.
That Chris said, this is a debate that could go either way in Australian society. We have seen recent research where people have actually been canvassed about these proposed changes, and it's not something that can go either way. We saw the vast majority, something like 70+% of people saying, no, we think that you should retain all elements of Section 18C. There was a very strong reaction to the government's proposals, and I imagine that will be borne out in the public's comments about the changes. The government has said, tell us what you think. People are telling parliamentarians what they think. We've seen members of the coalition say, I'm deeply uncomfortable with what is being proposed. People have talked about crossing the floor, although they're keeping their powder dry. So this is not something that people are kind of a bit ambivalent about. I would say the majority of Australians, and certainly the majority of my people, are deeply opposed to these changes and are saying as much.
And there is right now, when we're tweeting out, have a look at my laptop, the amendments to the Racial Discrimination Act open from between now and the end of this month, so people can actually send in what they think should be replacing 18C, their suggestions, and then we'll see where we go from there. Omar, where's the community taking us?
We have a lot of people who are raising the question about motivations of why this move is actually happening right now. We have King Charles here who tweeted in saying, the law has worked fine for the last 20 years. The only reason it's getting changed now is because of a bigot with a very big microphone. We have Lady Jo who goes on to say, certainly Australia needs those laws that ban hate speech, always has been a racist, but this government does all it can to foster hatred, inequality, nationalism, racism, and division. And Christy, just right back to you. Do you think this goes too far, essentially assigning sinister motives to the people who are trying to get this law repealed?
It could be. I would certainly say that there are people out there with less than pure motives. But I wonder if I could probably define it as, for some people it's an interesting legal conundrum, or it's a a fascinating philosophical debate. But these are very real issues. We are talking about the harm that is caused to people through racist speech. And the progression, and as I said, there's a clear nexus towards racist violence. So it's not just something interesting to talk about at a dinner party or, to throw around and joust in a conversation. These are people's lives. Racism has a very real impact on people's lives.
Simon.
And I think we all need to be listening to Kirsty and the people who are subject to this harm. The calls for change come from people who are in a position of power, who are able to cause harm, and who I think ought to be volunteering to constrain themselves in their power of causing harm. People who are harmed are not calling for this law to be changed. It's a matter of exercising power in the community. It's a matter of exercising the power of speech and recognising that a classic liberal constraint on speech is the causing of harm. And when people who are caused harm say, don't let this happen to us, I'd expect our government to listen rather than to be leading a charge in the opposite direction.
I just wanted
And Simon and everyone, the mark of a society is how it looks after its vulnerable people, the people who are not powerful, the people that don't have access to massive influence. That is the mark of a society, to look after those people and to ensure that all of its citizens are protected from these very fundamental harms.
Let me just play you a little bit from an anti-racist campaign that dates back to 2011 in Australia, so a couple of years ago, a little bit old. But this is what some people were talking about, some Australians were talking about how racist they felt their own society was. Have a listen to this.
It started in kindergarten for me. Yeah, so it continued right through. Yeah, unfortunately, it's everywhere,
Yes, I have. When I was very young. It's evident everywhere, so you can't really escape it. And just got to be resilient and learn to live with it.
Oh, well, 2 days ago I walked outside with a scarf around my head. I'm not Islamic at all, but everyone assumed I was Muslim, and I could definitely feel a different vibe walking down the street. And I was riding my bike past an old lady's house, and she just took up a newspaper and threw it at me, and she said, "Go back to your own country."
So, Chris, does this put you in a slightly awkward position? Because how much hate speech have you ever experienced in your lifetime?
Well, I wouldn't say that I've experienced a great deal of hate speech, and obviously I'm a white middle-class Australian in an Australian suburb, so I'm not going to pretend to put myself in the position. But I think it's important to know and to understand that the virtue of freedom of speech is that it allows all people to speak their minds on all matters as well. And I think that the freedom of speech is an absolutely fundamental part of Australian democracy. It's also quite important to contextualise this in the Australian political context as well. This is not the only debate that we are and have been having about freedom of speech. We've had actually 3 years of quite lengthy and aggressive debate on the limits of freedom of speech. The Australian government tried to introduce press regulation in the same manner that the British government is trying to do so. There were some reforms to human rights and anti-discrimination acts that were seen as quite severe restrictions on freedom of speech. And it is all part of what the government considers to be its freedom agenda, which is a step forward for freedom of speech as a basic democratic liberal virtue.
All right, so Kirsty, I would
freedom agenda.
Kirsty, I would love you to leave us with one story that just reminds us why you feel that hate speech should still remain illegal, as far as we're talking about sort of racist acts, racist attitudes that are being spoken out there in public. Leave us with one story.
There are so many. I know as a child we were, not necessarily as a child because I'm getting on in years, but you know, it's common for people to be at sporting matches, for example, and to have racial abuse hurled at them. You know, I've had the experience where I'm sitting there with my mum, people are hurling racist abuse over our heads at my brother running on the football field. The conundrum for us was then, do we communicate to him what people have been saying to us from the stalls? But it's important if someone is abusing you, unfortunately, it's better that you know than you don't know. But, you know, the reluctance of people then to say, look, I feel safe, you know, I feel like I'm part of a team, I feel that, you know, I have a role to play and I feel that people value me. You know, people getting abused on buses, abused in the workplaces, they you know, these are daily occurrences and they're just unacceptable.
That's Kirsty Parker. Kirsty, thank you for being part of our conversation. Thank you to Chris Berg and also Simon Rice as well. So on the next programme, we're heading to Mexico, where activists say that a proposed telecom bill will give the government too much control over the media. Check out hashtag EPN versus Internet on Twitter, then join us on Monday for that conversation. Until then, see you online. Take care.